Welcome back to Distance Learning. We're going to start Unit 5 today. Specifically, Unit 5 is going to tell us a lot about early political parties in the United States and some of our first presidents and kind of some of the contributions that they make. So really today we're starting off talking about George Washington and his farewell address. But before we get going today, one thing you guys are going to want to make sure you do as you're going through this is on Google Classroom, I will have posted your farewell address assignment. This is going to be a 10-point assignment. I figured I'd go through it with you because you can fill this out as I'm going through your notes. And as much as I can, I want your notes to be able to be really easy so you can go through and just really fill this out as you go. Again, this is a 10-point assignment on Google Classroom. So as you're listening to my PowerPoint presentation, all you need to do is answer the following questions for this 10-point assignment. First question for 3 points, list 3 challenges that the nation faced according to George Washington. So as George Washington's leaving office, what are 3 challenges that in his opinion the United States was facing? Your second 3 points comes from this question. List 3 precedents, which are examples for other people to follow that George Washington set when he was president of the United States. So what are 3 examples that Washington used for other people to follow during his time as president? And then the last 4 points, in 4 sentences, so make sure you're writing at least 4 so I can give you full credit, explain in your own words if you believe that the United States and our presidents since Washington have followed his advice from this farewell address. So in 4 sentences, overall, do you think that our presidents follow what George Washington said, or do you think they ignore it? Or basically just what is your stance on that particular topic? So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get into the farewell address. Again, once you're done completing this, make sure you turn it into me on Google Classroom because this will be graded for points. So just FYI there. Alright, so George Washington's farewell address was published in 1796. As everybody probably knows, you probably learned about this in elementary school, George Washington was president number 1. Okay, he was our first president. So at the end of his 8 years as president, he publishes what becomes known as his farewell address, which is basically like his advice to the United States. I kind of have my farewell address with you guys at the end of the school year that I'll give you, which just gives my advice for high school, where you'll have had me a full year as a teacher, you know a lot about me, and then I just kind of, hey, I'm going to be all done teaching you, but here's my advice moving forward. And George Washington really does the same thing with the United States. And of course, much like myself, he was very well respected among American citizens. And so they really wanted to hear what George has to say. So here's some facts about his farewell address. It wasn't actually a speech, so this isn't something where George Washington got up and gave his famous speech to Congress or to the American people or anything like that. In fact, all it was this writing that he did that was printed in newspapers and then made into pamphlets. So basically, it was just this idea that Washington had where he kind of wanted to tell the American people what he thought should happen moving forward when his time as president was done. He wrote this farewell address late in his second term as president, so he's almost at the very end of his presidency, and these are basically just his reflections during that time. As you've probably figured out, he decided not to run for a third term as president. He could have. At this point in American history, there was no constitutional amendment saying that George Washington couldn't serve more than 2 terms. And quite frankly, in my humble opinion, I think he would have. I think people would have reelected him. They loved George Washington. They thought he was great. He helped us in the Revolution. He helps us establish our Constitution, our government. He runs our country, and he was so well respected. But he didn't want to be like King George. He thought that that would give a president too much power. So he decides not to run for a third term in office. That tradition, by the way, continued on until Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected to 4 straight times in 1930s and the 1940s. So one thing that you understand there is that this is going to be something that most presidents would do, but after FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was elected to 4 straight terms, we actually passed a constitutional amendment saying no more than 2 terms in a row for a United States president. His farewell address was his advice to the nation and basically just what he wanted to see moving forward. Again, make sure you're filling out your sheets as we go through this because I'm literally going through the answers right now. So, what was it that George Washington had to say? Here were 3 challenges that he said that were facing our nation. And again, make sure you're writing these down. This is part of your assignment. One example of something he thought was a challenge for us is what's called sectionalism. Sectionalism is where people care more about their area than the country as a whole. We see this a lot in sports rivalries. Michigan fans don't really care about Michigan State. And I can sincerely tell you from personal experience, Michigan State fans don't care much for the Wolverines either. That's an example of sports sectionalism where we only care about ourselves. We only care about this one group. We don't care about everybody. And Washington, at a national level, was afraid that we wouldn't care about the country as a whole. We would only care about individual states, and that people would be very selfish and that they wouldn't think about others. Different things going on in the present day. We think about sectionalism. Are there different areas of the country who don't care about the country as a whole and only care about themselves? That's a question that you can kind of answer in your own opinion. The second challenge Washington felt that was facing our nation was political parties. People would often wrap themselves up so much in their political party that they wouldn't think for themselves, and Washington feared that we would have only 2 major political parties. In, again, today's world, I think we would definitely have some people who say that people are so wrapped up in their own political parties that they are 100% allegiant to. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is totally up to you. But obviously, we only have 2 dominant political parties in the United States today, the Republicans and the Democrats. So that was a problem as far as Washington was concerned. And then the last challenge he said that we had facing our nation was foreign alliances. George Washington really didn't want us to see the United States choose sides. At this point, we were a very young nation. We were a very inexperienced nation. We didn't have a lot going for us, truthfully. And George Washington didn't want to see us choose sides. Now, you've probably had this experience in your own life where, let's say you got 2 of your friends and they're fighting and they're bickering and there's this big problem. If you choose to help out one friend over here, then this friend over here is probably going to be pretty mad at you. If you help this friend over here, then this friend over here is going to be mad at you. So George Washington's advice was to stay out of it. If you've ever had that experience, you side with one friend over the other, now you've got at least one of those friends angry with you. So Washington's advice was that we should stay neutral. We shouldn't worry about what other countries are doing or choose sides. In his mind, we were a very young country, and we needed to focus on ourselves first and foremost. Some different precedents, some different examples that Washington sets forward as a president. And again, this is going to be one of your vocabulary terms for this unit, precedent. It sounds a lot like president, so it's a good way to remember it. But a precedent is an example set that acts as a guide for others to follow. Hopefully, I've been setting the precedent for you to get online and do your distance learning each and every day as we go through social studies. Hopefully, that's a precedent that you set forward. So 3 precedents set forward by George Washington. One is the cabinet. The cabinet is a group of advisors to the President of the United States, and George Washington decided to do this during his first term in office as president. Washington felt like he wasn't an expert in everything and that he needed advice and insight from people who were in the know. And so what he chose to do is to have a cabinet give him advice on different parts of being president. So in today's world, we still see that. In fact, every president since George Washington has had a cabinet. What do cabinet members do? So there would be cabinet members for the Secretary of Defense would be one cabinet, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Education, the Secretary of Agriculture. Like these are just different examples of people who are going to advise the president. And again, every president since Washington has had those. Second precedent that he set was serving only 2 terms of 4 years is what I meant to say. President Washington thought that this was a good idea to make sure that no one person had too much power like a king. And so that was a precedent that presidents ran with and did until Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1900s. And as I mentioned in the last slide, the 22nd Amendment put term limits there. So only 2 4-year terms can now be served by a United States president. Last precedent that we see set by George Washington were that other presidents have given farewell addresses, or basically advice to the nation moving forward. Most recently, that was done by former President Barack Obama. It will be interesting as we see here in 2020 the change from President Trump to President-elect Biden if Trump gives us a farewell address, either a speech or a document kind of outlining what he would like to see for the nation. So that remains to be seen if that's a precedent that President Trump will keep or not. But those are 3 precedents set forward by George Washington. If you have questions about any of this stuff, please make sure you let me know. And I do need this turned in, that document, of course, that we looked at right here. I do need that turned in on Google Classroom for a 10-point assignment. Feel free to message me with any of the contact information in this post if you need any help. Have a great day.